All right, welcome everybody to the Sustainability in the Age of Trump webinar. We're going to talk a little bit about the sustainability outlook in 2017. I'm super excited to be here today with Tim and Zachary, and I'll let them present themselves in just a second. What we're going to do is we're going to go through a little bit of an introduction of a recent survey that we did here at LinkedIn that gave us some indication about a few hundred of the people. And then after we talk about the survey results, we'll talk a little bit of a panel discussion where we got some questions talking about what does this mean? What are we expecting? What's going to be happening in this area of sustainability over the next year or so. So just real quick, I'm Rolf von Sosen. I run marketing here at Lucid, and we are a data technology company for energy management systems. I'll let Tim and Zachary introduce themselves. Tim?
Thanks, Rolf. This is Tim Porter. I'm responsible for our partnership organization here at Urginet. So we help companies that use the data that we can help them acquire on behalf of their customers. So happy to be joining you on this webinar today.
Great. Zach?
My name is Zach Sheelan. I work for a company called the Cadmus Group. I manage projects related to educating folks on tracking energy and on recognizing outstanding energy performance. So I do a lot of work with finding data solutions to help people effortlessly track energy use day to day and then turn those energy tracking metrics into savings opportunities.
Okay, fantastic. So what we'll do is, like I said, I'll go through sort of some of the learnings that we had from the survey. As I'm going through it, and as the discussion is happening, if there are questions that you have that you'd like to ask or you'd like to bring forward, go ahead and use the questions feature in the GoToMeeting, and we'll track those questions and hopefully try to answer them during the event, or also we'll be collecting and go through some of the questions at the end. So at the beginning of the year, obviously there was a lot of discussion about where is this, where's sustainability going? What is the new administration? There was a lot of noise about the new administration, what their view on sustainability, on the sustainability industry was, specifically on government organizations. And so it sort of pushed us to say, look, it'd be really interesting to sort of find out what are individuals thinking, what is important to them, how do they see the future of this industry. So we launched this survey. It went out to, we had a couple hundred responses on that. And it was interesting, the responses were fairly divided. It was actually, I think, at the end of the day, it was 50% from the private sector, and then 50% from the public, education, higher education sector, and so forth. So it's actually an interesting sample that we have in terms of a data set. First and foremost, we're going to ask the question about, is sustainability still a priority? And what was, I think, really exciting and encouraging was that 73% of the surveyed organizations expect their commitments to sustainability to remain the same in 2017. And then 20% actually planning their commitment to increase. So we actually saw definitely something that isn't sort of a response to the administration, but what we're seeing is that the responsibility definitely is much more inherent in the organization and part of the organization, and not so dependent on the public administration and so forth. One of the things that really stood out to me as I was looking at the responses for the survey was something in the sustainability, sort of in this area, in this profession, is the vast areas of titles and responsibilities that fall under this. And I think that's something that was really interesting, because it sort of, we looked at titles that go from facility managers to sustainability to building operators to all kinds of other different types of titles, as well as in terms of the sustainability kind of encompasses a lot of different initiatives, from greenhouse gas emission reduction to transportation planning to green buildings to energy procurement, waste management, obviously energy and water conservation. It was actually really interesting to sort of see in some of the information that we got about the respondents what a broad set of responsibilities and titles are part of this industry. Another question that we asked was about the organizational commitment. And this one was really interesting to sort of see about how big the corporate mission played into this. And what we saw was that individuals really focused on that it's, over 50%, about 50% that the corporate mission is sort of the top driver of what is driving them. The second one then was business performance is an extremely strong driver, and industry recognition. So when we look at this, actually compliance and government reporting is sort of, kind of a much smaller aspect that drives a lot of these individuals. And again, going back to the fact that this is sort of a 50-50 responses from private and public sector, I think it's pretty interesting, because you would think obviously corporate would skew this towards the corporate mission and business performance. So, but I think what we're seeing is that even in public organizations, they are starting to really focus in on it's just part of their mission. Whether it's a federal government or the current administration or something, it's actually very separate from the dedication that these individual organizations have to these. In terms of the question about budget, that is one place where we did actually see sort of an interesting change, I think, from the public to the private sector. And I think when we look at the public sector, we are seeing a little bit of a more pessimistic view in terms of the budget and where the budget is going to go, being that their budget is much more dependent on the administration. That said, I think the majority still are thinking there isn't going to be a change in it, and especially in the private sector, we do see that increasing. And I think this is sort of a continuous theme that we saw throughout this, is there is so much momentum in this, and there is so much belief, I think, that this is the right way of doing business, that it is not something where companies and individuals saying, hey, I'm doing this just because of some sort of regulatory thing. But people are doing this because it's good business, and it's for them, an individual, and for their company. Next, talk a little bit about a state of the profession. And so this is now starting to get sort of really personal, if you will, in terms of the profession and what people foresee about the profession. And what we're seeing is, if you look at these charts and you start with in the US and then go about in your organization and in your role, I think you see a definitive trend there that as you start getting more specific about individuals, people are very bullish. I think people are very, they see the future. They're very positive about the future of their role and what this is doing in their company. It's interesting when we abstract it, when we take it a step back. And I think that's part of sort of the question. It sort of then says, if we talk about it in the US, I think we then take a step back and look at the administration and the presidency in that in a lot larger way. So we kind of then see it as more in a pessimistic way. But as soon as we kind of start drilling down into what does this mean for me personally, I think that's where people are actually very positive and are seeing some very positive momentum. Then sort of in this vein of being very specific, we then talked a little bit about sustainability, about the job itself and how the job itself is changing. It was interesting to see that the size of the team, people are not expecting sizes of teams to scale back. I I think you can look at that and it's like, hey, we're already operating with skeleton crews, so we can't scale back. Or we just think that I think it is going to continue to be more important of an area. And I think that's sort of what we're seeing in terms of the majority of responses seeing the size of the team not changing or actually slightly increasing. Another really interesting fact to me that really popped out is the two graphs on the right-hand side that talk about cross-organizational support and collaboration with other sustainability professionals. And I think what that's showing is that as an industry and as a larger group, there's starting to become much more interdependency within an organization, so sustainability efforts. And again, I think some of this goes back to the breadth of when we say sustainability. It means so many things in different organizations, but it is definitely becoming part of the culture, part of everybody in the organization that's engaging and part of this. Also, collaboration with other sustainability professionals. I was really sort of glad to see that, and that's going to be something that's really important, and people continue to build the fabric across organizations, across industries, to find best practices, to benchmark how they're doing, and collaborate that way. So I think that's a fantastic trend for the industry in and of itself. The last one, which is really interesting too, I think, is the focus on quantitative metrics. And that was really interesting to us because I think, that actually, to a certain degree, I'm a big believer that, we all know the old adage, right? You can't improve what you can't measure. Well, you also can't make a business case what you don't measure, and you can't get funding for what you don't measure. So I think actually this focus on quantitative metrics and so forth is a great sign for the industry that is becoming a bigger part, a foundational part of doing business, and we're getting better and better at making those business cases. The question that then obviously leads to is, okay, data is very important, but what types of data are most important? And as you can see here, not surprisingly, energy use and energy cost jump to the front. And those are obviously some of the biggest costs that there are and some of the biggest drivers. What was interesting to see is that benchmarking is something that's becoming very important to individuals, being able to understand where they are compared to other individuals. Obviously, we see water consumption and greenhouse gas emissions being a big piece. What's interesting is that in terms of the data, occupant satisfaction, employee productivity are very low. And to me, that's kind of interesting. And I think it's actually an opportunity for the industry moving forward, right? As we get better and better at getting our head around the energy use, the energy costs, some of these consumptions and emissions, as we get better at measuring and seeing that data, I think it gives us an opportunity to then focus also on, well, what does this do to engaging employees and making them more productive? And how does sustainability start being something that is not an end in and of itself, but actually something that is infused into the overarching productivity of a company? Again, I think that's more of a sort of a more the future trend that we're seeing. I think what we're seeing going into 2017, people are still very much focused on the meat and potatoes, if you will, in terms of, what are the hard data that we need to take a look at to drive down costs, to drive down consumption on these things. So that's kind of a quick tour through the survey that we had and some of the results we got from it. What we want to do now is shift over to more sort of a panel discussion about relevant topics to this. And again, excited to have Tim and Zach with me here today. And we wanted to start with maybe the one that's like the most exciting one, or the most sort of the biggest one that a lot of us struggle with, which is the making that business case. And Zach, you have quite a bit of experience in helping make this business case. Why don't you kind of get us started on sort of this discussion and making that business case?
Thanks, Ralph. How's making the business case for sustainability projects changing? I see two big themes. One is that we talk a lot about data. Big data is not just about energy. Decision makers have a plethora of data on different investment opportunities. So it's not solely making the business case for sustainability project, but why the sustainability project has a better business case than all of those other options. The other corollary to that is that for many organizations, a lot of the low-hanging fruit has been done. Those slam dunk projects that had a very quick payback, simple financial return, those are gone. So how do you continue to make a successful business case when you get into the types of sustainability measures that appear to have diminishing returns? And one of the ways that I've seen organizations do that is, to Ralph's point earlier, making a connection between the sustainability project and a solid financial return in another area of the firm's performance. I saw this presentation from Food Lion about their energy efficiency work over the last year. They did some LED retrofits throughout their store portfolio, and they had images of them. What stuck out to me about that measure, it certainly saved them a lot of energy costs, and that certainly played a role in justifying the project and getting approval from management. But just looking at the picture of the before and the after, what stuck out to me was the fact that their lighting was so much better in terms of quality, that their worker safety was better, their products were being highlighted in a more flattering way with the improved lighting. That has a big impact on some of the things that retail decision makers do think about every day, like foot traffic and earnings per store. And so in making the case to management to invest in those energy efficiency projects, we do need to start thinking at the edge and figuring out, what does my management think about when they get up in the morning? Could be building asset value if you're in commercial real estate. If you're in K-12 school, it could be how to continue to hire new teachers under heavy budget constraints. And how do we connect the energy savings that I get from an investment in an efficiency project to those outcomes that my decision makers have at the top of their minds every day? I'm curious to hear what Ralph and Tim have seen.
Yeah, Zach, I love that. I think that's a great point in terms of connecting the energy efficiency with the business performance, right? So it's not this isolated thing. And I think that's one of the things that we saw in some of the responses, that there's much tighter collaboration between some of the energy projects, the infrastructure projects, sustainability projects, and the business performance as a whole. Tim?
Yeah, I think that Zach brings up some really good points about what it is that's driving some of these applications. We've started to see more customers that are taking the view that's a lot more global within their organization, as opposed to regional or state-led or even kind of country-led initiatives across the organization. They're getting more of a purview that takes them into countries outside of even where their headquarters are. And I think that that's something that just by its nature elevates the visibility of something like this, of a project like this, that provides justifications for lots of constituents other than just maybe the handful of sustainability guys in the U.S. that are hoping to, have a good report come out for how their buildings here are performing. So I think there's a lot of drivers, and as these projects get bigger, kind of organizationally wide, I think that's making the business case something that's got a lot more elements to it that would make a lot more people within the organization interested in the outcomes.
I think one of the things that's been interesting that I've seen in a couple of companies that we've worked with recently is a much closer alignment between the, I'm going to use the word facility sustainability in a very collective term here, but from that team with the finance team, and working very closely with the finance team and some of their financial planning folks, getting much more involved. So the conversations are a lot less, hey, I'm on the facility side or on the infrastructure side and I'm trying to push this business case into finance. It's a lot more of a collaborative approach and saying, hey, finance team, can one of your guys, help me put this business case together, or help me understand how we best manage operating expenses and capital investments to make this business case. So I think there's definitely, because I think then it's not just the sustainability team or infrastructure team or something trying to make that business case. You actually start collecting that various inputs and kind of going back to Zach's point, right, where it's not just, hey, this isn't just going to save us some money, but it's actually going to create a better environment for employees and make us more productive as a company. So. Moving on to the next one, we talked a little bit about collecting the right data, and one of the things that sort of a crossover from this, what we were just talking about before, what we've seen is that the data that individuals are collecting is starting to go kind of well beyond just one facility, and I think that's where some of the large business cases are really starting to also find their footing, is that when I'm looking at the data, I'm not just looking at the data of one facility, one medical facility, but I'm looking at that medical facility and the associated office buildings together, and potentially 2 other sister facilities that go together. Or when I'm taking a look at a sort of a campus that may be a physical campus, or it may be a virtual campus of a tech company here in the Bay Area that we're working with, right? They're not looking at these as individual buildings as much as they are looking at it collectively and putting the infrastructure in place so they can see all this in a much larger sort of a macro picture that allows them to look at it at a holistic level versus at just one building by another building. Tim, what are you seeing in terms of what individuals are doing, companies are doing in terms of collecting the right data?
Yeah, I think your observation that being able to see things at a macro level is very accurate. It's clearly something that people are interested on a corporate level to see what it is that they're consuming, what impact each building is having, but do that in a way that can be comparative, that they can look at how they're doing against other buildings within their own portfolio, or how they're doing and stacking up against others in their industry. But it's really kind of the data needs and what defines the right data has expanded in a couple of directions, actually. One is clearly being able to expand so that you're, as you said, from a macro level, seeing it for lots of buildings. But it's also expanding kind of down into the micro level as well, so that people are wanting to see a bit more granular data to increase the insight that they get. So clearly, an accurate knowledge of the total usage by location is obvious. I think your chart showed that from the survey that was really the first type of data that people are looking for, as well as cost. Cost, I think, was the second most important, and really marrying the supply side and the demand side of the cost, or the energy equation by building, is important to a lot of people, interesting to a lot of stakeholders within the organization. But it's not just for electricity. I think you also denoted on that graph that water is becoming very important for people, and often people think about sustainability just in terms of what smoke they're putting into the air, or what gas they're burning, or electricity that they're churning through. But it really is increasing across trade lines. We've had more and more people be as interested in water as they are electricity and gas, and that's probably much more from a pure sustainability perspective as opposed to a cost, because water is typically not a huge budget item unless you're doing something like making beverages. But we've even seen people ask for things like steam and fuel oil. And in one case, I heard of a customer asking for timber information, believe it or not. So there's a lot of commodity types that are being encompassed by this. We had the head of sustainability for Delta spoke at one of our conferences recently. It was fascinating hearing how driven their entire sustainability performance was by fuel, and that was really their biggest metric for them to manage and monitor. So it's kind of getting broader, not just from a location standpoint, but also from a commodity type standpoint. But from a micro level, more granular data is becoming more and more interesting to people. So usage by time of day, for instance, where that type of information is available if you're on a time of use tariff of some kind, and you can get information readily if you have the right tools in place that tells you how much you used between the hours of 8 a.m. and noon, and between noon and 4 o'clock, and over the evenings. And so that level of granularity really gives you a lot of insight. And in particular, when you're looking for sustainability opportunities, having that level of granularity allows you to get a lot more intelligent about some of the changes that you could make, shifting production schedules or changing times that people come in, that type of thing. So the data is really expanding. The right data is expanding both sort of at a macro level, but also on a micro level, to needing things that are more granular. As far as what people are looking for in the data, I guess at a high level, you're looking for outliers first and foremost, but you're also looking for something that would allow you to do some comparative work with yourself, with other buildings in your organization, or with others in your industry. But those are sort of the high level things that I think people typically are always looking for in the data that we've seen so far. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Zach or Rolf, but those are kind of the insights that we see on the data collection.
I love Tim's point about sustainability tracking expanding in both directions. I'm seeing organizations that were tracking pockets of facilities now tracking their entire portfolio across the country or even globally, and that's at the high end. And they're using metrics from that portfolio level tracking, corporate disclosure reporting. And then down at the individual facility level, we're also seeing monthly data is not enough for some of these organizations. They're wanting real-time interval data every 15 minutes. They're wanting solutions that will meter each and every end use in their space. My company had one metering solution set up to the point where we could literally tell that part of our weekend energy use in our office was because we left the monitor and the front conference room on. So it's been great to see the additional granularity come at both ends of the spectrum to drive some better decisions.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think actually leads us a little bit into the next point, which is talking about some of the right tools, because I think that I love the fact that kind of how Tim was talking about sort of that granular view, having interval data and all that stuff. But I think we all find that Excel gets pretty laborious pretty quickly when we get those levels of data, and also trying to make that business case with that level of data sort of then requires us to have a whole new set of skill sets, right? And some of us have sort of been forced into developing new sets of skill sets in terms of how do we manage data, and if we're collecting all this information, how do we then tell a story with that data that, one, sets us up for, okay, what actions should we take to get us to the right goals? And then secondly, how do we then use that data to make the business case to get the funding that we need for it? And I think we're, from my vantage point, some of the things that I'm seeing is sort of a real investment to look at what are some tool sets that I can use to aggregate data from different places. If I'm getting data from different systems, whether they are different buildings, different energy management systems, different meters, smart meters, whether it's utilities in different places, right? It's how do I have a system that allows me to bring in all this data to present this one comprehensive picture. And I know that Tim, this is a sort of a big part of what Urginet does too, right? And you work with a lot of companies that are sort of starting that journey and saying, hey, I'm getting all this data. How can I start automating the collection of this data?
That's right. That's right. It's really a combination of a couple of categories of tools, I guess. One would be being able to have a tool set that helps answer questions that you need to answer, but at the same time doing that on top of a set of data that you know you can trust to let the tools provide some insight that you value and that you believe. So it's really sort of a combination of data visualization and analytics types of tools, as well as data aggregation tools to make sure the data set that you have is one that you're confident in. So one of the big elements that is important in selecting these, for sure, you want to make sure that you're able to answer the questions you need to answer. And so that's important to go in with an understanding of what are the things you want to try to make sure you can answer for your organization. But the other thing that's really important is that you end up with something that's hands-free for the most part, something that you can wind up and let run. Because I know a lot of times, and my wife works for a large retailer and helps run some corporate facilities for them, and often those folks the sustainability people get bad reps because they're the ones that have great thoughts about things they can do to save the planet and make their organizations more efficient, but they're doing that by having facilities managers have to type data into spreadsheets every month, or they're doing that by asking people to do things that are not necessarily things that are important to their specific jobs, but if they don't do them, then none of the efforts that they're undertaking are going to be fruitful. So it really needs to be something that not just is something you can trust and that gives you the insight that you want, but can be something that doesn't impose significantly on the rest of the organization. So I think as far as looking at the right set of tools, they need to do the job for you, but they also need to do it in a way that's not intrusive or as little impact on the rest of the organization as possible. That's really where things start to get effective. If this is a robot that you can wind up on that run and the insight comes in based on work that software is doing for you, then you can really, really start to expand with a starting point and end up places you never thought you might end up.
Right. Zach, how about you? What are you seeing out there in terms of people being successful and how they're using technology to help them manage all this data?
As I've worked with different organizations, I encourage everybody to ask 3 questions when they're deciding what tool to use. First, what resources do we have? Do we have the budget to hire a service provider or an automated solution to manage this? And if we do, excellent. And if we don't, then who is going to be doing this instead? Is it going to be me? Is it going to be the lead in accounting? Is it going to be the intern that we're hiring in 2 months to program all this data into the tool? At the end of the day, I've worked with a lot of groups that have energy data centralized and that have access to free tools to track it. And then I give them a spiel on how to track their energy, and I come back in 4 months and nothing happened. And it's because they didn't ask those questions and they didn't slot in the tools that they chose to use to how their internal business process works. So the third question is, what is the goal of using this tool? Are we trying to make a business case for replacing our building systems? If that's the case, you may want to use something like DOE's Energy Asset Score tool, or you may want to bring in a service provider and do a virtual audit to assess the cost benefit of doing that. If you're not, if you're just trying to track at the building level and make more behavior change improvements in energy use, then you may want something that's a little bit lighter touch, like Portfolio Manager through Energy Star, which requires less data, is more basic, is a little more intuitive to use for a new user. So if you ask those questions, you delegate a champion who's in charge of making all of this come together and for regularly checking on progress, you're going to be much more successful. And to the point about what solutions are available to help you with data access, there are more and more utilities now that will automatically either give you a download of your utility data in a spreadsheet form, or that will automate pushing that data into a tool like Energy Star Portfolio Manager, especially if you're in a city with a benchmarking and disclosure requirement. So that's one way for you to more or less free get a solution that will pipe data into a centralized place where you can run reports, get metrics, and get insights.
I think that's great insight, great perspective. I always like a list of 3. It's about all I can get my head around. I think one of the things that I really have observed in this sort of the right tools is I'm going to go back to this thing I said before about telling a story. And because I think a lot of times, you know, in areas like this, you can get hung up on the fact that you have a tremendous amount of information available, but you can very quickly lose the story or the business case you're trying to tell because of the overwhelming amount of information. You know, I always think back to when I was in my mid-late 20s. I worked for, I was part of the first group of people that came to California to figure out how to sell deregulated electricity for a small, well, for a small energy company out of Houston. We'll just leave it there. And as I was doing, you know, I was in deal structuring, and I would have these gigantic spreadsheets that I would put together for all kinds of projects that we would do. And I would put these in front of people, and they'd be like, well, now what? What's your point? And I would look at them and be like, well, duh, do you not see, you know, cell, you know, Q74 clearly shows, and this trend is, and I always really remember that, because I think, especially in this industry where we're diving down deep and understanding the data and the patterns, and as Tim said before, looking for anomalies, we can very quickly lose sight of how we need to visualize and tell the story to individuals if we're saying, hey, we need this kind of investment to reduce peak demand, or we need to invest in this infrastructure so we can optimize the building scheduling, the schedules for the buildings turning on and turning off and so forth. So I just really want to underscore this concept of, it's not just about us ingesting the data and bringing it in, but the right tools really need to be able to tell the story to all those outside, whether it's the finance group, the management team, whether it's occupants that we're trying to change behavior for. That's a critical piece of that. And you know, with that, I'll sort of turn it back to a little bit to preparing for the future. I'll sort of start on sort of that soapbox that I was just on about who is the audience and how do we better democratize this information and get it out to people. And I think that's going to be more and more critical as us in the profession want to create that. And we shouldn't rely so much on regulatory reporting requirements or things like that sort of set the tone of this is how we have to do it. I think as an industry and as individuals, we just need to think about what's the best way for us to presenting this kind of data. The other point that there was actually a question that came in on that is about, you know, what if there is a decrease in funding for programs like Energy Star, for the EPA, for DOE, the building data set that they're building and so forth. I think, to me, the future of that should actually be very closely interdependent with the private sector. And collaborations like what we at Lucid did with the DOE and the EPA informing the benchmarkmybuilding.com website, where you can go in and benchmark your building very quickly, accessing those databases. I think those are a big part of the future of how private and public sector are going to be working together moving forward. With that, Zach, I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and you've got some interesting views on sort of what we're going to be expecting in the near and distant future here.
The reporting requirements are going to change because they're a gateway, they're a starting point. The point was never to shuffle annual energy data across a tool and send a spreadsheet to a city. The point is to gain a better window onto energy performance and financial performance for everybody who is affected by the energy use of buildings in these cities. And I think that what you're seeing now is the availability of this data from the initial disclosure requirements is starting the conversation. You have cities like Seattle and Philadelphia and New York who have built these wonderful visualizations of the energy data to the point where you can go search for a building on any of those websites, click on it on a satellite map, and you instantly see the annual energy performance of that building. That's great information for lessors. That's great information for owners, for developers. and that is going to spark more questions. If you're a new building in one of those markets, you come online, you have to know what the energy performance of your building is going to look like when disclosure time comes, because if you go to disclose and your Energy Star score is a 40 out of 100, you look really bad. And that conversation is going to expand to the entire building life cycle. I'm seeing that in certain areas, there's a conversation about moving from energy codes that are based on rated performance of pieces of equipment. So traditionally, code compliance has been, you check the box, I have the correct energy efficiency rating per unit output on my heater, chiller, lighting. We're now talking about moving into a world where energy code compliance is based on the actual performance of the whole building. It's called outcome-based codes. There are a couple of markets that are leading the way on this. And so those reporting requirements are going to start to touch on the earlier parts of the building life cycle, how the building is designed, how the building is energy modeled, and how that affects the types of building envelopes and the types of systems that you put in a building. And so I do anticipate more of these regulatory and reporting requirements, because the cities that don't yet have them are going to look at the cities that do have them and say, I'll have what New York's having. New York recently came out with a survey. Over 70% of the affected building owners by the mandate in that city for disclosure said that they made specific changes in operations, specific changes in building systems to improve energy performance. Other cities are seeing that, and they're going to want to achieve those same results to improve cost control for their building owners and to improve environmental quality in their cities.
That's great, Zach. I mean, I think it's so interesting, right? And so in terms of taking the responsibility for that. Tim, why don't you take us home with sort of your predictions of the future of how this is going to affect the sustainability profession?
I think one thing that's important, and we've seen this through talking with several customers that have started to roll out, starting with small but growing to very large sustainability projects, is that it's important to build what you're building so that it's really, as much as anything, a platform as opposed to a point solution. You just don't know what the changes are going to be that are waiting out there for us in the future, but you know that they're going to be changes. Who would have thought that when the ESOS program was put in place a couple of years ago, I guess, and implemented last year, that the UK was going to be leaving the European Union. So what impact is that going to have? Is that going to be a completely different set of reporting that's going to be mandated to organizations of certain sizes in the UK or not? So you just don't know what it is that the outputs are going to need to be. And to some extent, as we talked about the data needs changing and getting both bigger from a macro and more detailed from a micro standpoint, you don't know what the inputs are going to be necessarily either. So you really need to try to come up with a platform that can expand as both the input needs and the output needs are going to be changing, because you know that they're going to. One example I'll mention, we have one partner that we're working with that's got a customer that's got thousands of locations around the world. The project was initially just for their home country, their headquarters were based in, but they knew that as they went to get justification or get approval for their budget, they had to prove that this was something that would benefit the entire global organization. And so they put in their plan preparations for being able to handle all the different countries and all the different languages and all the different types of energy economies that were going to be spanned by all of their organizations. So they had to kind of prepare for a global future, even though they were starting much more locally. And that was something that they had to start with from the beginning. So that type of planning, I think, where you're looking at what you're implementing as a platform as opposed to a point solution for a specific either reporting requirement or even business metric, is something that that's really important to make sure you're future-proofing whatever it is that you're spending money on.
I think that's a great point. What a wonderful point to I think close on, Tim, in terms of, I think if we look at any of these, making the business case, collecting the right data, identifying the right tools, preparing for the future, I think the point that what I was just thinking of when you were talking about it's just, I think we really need to make sure we have our house in order, right? And I sort of think about, we have the process in place, the people in place, and the sort of technology in place to be able to manage any kind of input and story that we need to tell, business cases that we need to make, and reporting that then needs to go out. So I think that's a great underlying point for all these 4 areas. We had a group of questions come in. I hope I addressed most of them through the through what we were talking about here. I think most of them, I think all of them pretty much got addressed. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining. I was joking at the beginning that, hey, we'll just, make this kind of a 30 minutes or so and hit the points, but I think there's just so much to talk about here. Please also feel free if anybody wants to kind of have some input at the end in terms of other things they would like us to discuss or things we would you would want us to incorporate into a future webinar. Let us know. We'd love the feedback. And with that, I want to extend a very warm thank you to Tim Porter and to Zach Shilin for participating with us here today and making the time. Thank you very much.
Our pleasure, Rob. Thanks for inviting us.
Happy to do it. Thanks, everyone.